We have a little bit of a special one for you guys today. This is the Browning Recoilless Trap Shotgun. Now, in the grand scheme of interesting shotguns, I'm not going to say that this is maybe the most interesting, but it is certainly one of the more unique operating systems to be packed into a shotgun. Now, at first glance, just sort of running down the specs on this, it's a single-shot, bolt-action shotgun. That doesn't really seem that interesting. There's, in fact, many bolt-action single-shot shotguns that have existed earlier in history, and they're like $50 pawn shop specials. So what makes this so different? Well, it's in the name. That recoilless system is really what sets this gun apart from a great number of guns that are out there. Now, to give a little bit of historical context, Browning made this gun in the 1990s, and it would ultimately be a bit of a sales failure. They didn't make very many of them, and in today's money, they cost about $5,000 new, which is a lot. But to contextualize that, there in the 1990s, trap was becoming very popular in the United States, and there was a fairly large market for middle-class people to sort of buy that upper middle-class gun, like, sort of get into a hobby like owning a boat. Well, you can spend $5 grand on a shotgun and it'd be okay as long as you're really going to be dedicated to shooting trap. That's not, it's not something out of the picture to do, is drop a lot of money on a gun. There was a lot of different companies that would do small-scale production of very custom bespoke trap guns. And of course, you'd have all sorts of features like generally a recoil reduction system, you'd have adjustability in the stock, you'd have the gun be generally really heavy, quite long barrel, quite long in overall length, because all of these factors tend to make it a little bit better catered to being a trap-specific gun. And then, of course, when we say trap, we're referring to American trap, where you only ever need one shot in the gun, because I know that's a question sometimes people ask is, why only one shot? Well, when you're shooting American trap, one shot's all you're ever going to need. It's all you're ever allowed to have. Meanwhile, in European trap, there's, of course, 2 shots allowed. So even in singles trap, European trap, there's 2 shots allowed, so if you miss, you're allowed to take a second shot. So there's a little bit of a difference there, so I know there's some confusion, because European trap guns will be, an over-under as a European trap gun, because they are allowed 2 shots. Meanwhile here, right, this is really just built with the American trap practice in mind. Now, when it comes to Browning shotguns, they of course have quite a legacy, especially in the United States. They've long been a sort of favored brand. It's maybe like the Corvette of shotguns, where there's some amount of American pride attributed there, but it's that upper middle class, having one means that you're someone to a certain class of people, and certainly I can identify with that. Browning for shotguns is sort of synonymous with Colt for early revolvers, right? It's that there's some amount of thoroughbred going on there. So Browning was really situated to seize a market that they really already had a grasp on. Right? People already liked and appreciated Browning shotguns, and so Browning had a decent opportunity to offer that, custom made, but from a factory, from a good gun maker that's got a warranty, trap shotgun for the people who are sort of interested in sinking, $5 grand into a trap gun that they'd shoot the heck out of. The thing that Browning had really done that was unique here, of course, was the recoilless system. In a nutshell, this system had shown up before in other systems, and basically, right, the short version, we'll get into the long version as we take the gun apart, but the short version of how it works is you have a receiver inside of your receiver. Pulling the trigger lets the inner receiver slump forward, and the gun fires as the inner receiver is on its way forward, which means that the mass of the inner receiver coming forward against that spring has to be reversed by the recoil generated from firing the round to turn the action back around, and then you recock it back to that previous position. As a result, recoil is actually smoothed out dramatically. And in the shooting segment of this video, we'll do a couple of tests just to sort of showcase that it might not actually be literally recoilless, but in the grand scheme of 9.5-pound shotguns, this is really, really light shooting. You can sort of compare it to, some of Beretta's more modern trap shooting or sporting shooting shotguns are like 8.5 with accessories, 8.5, 9-pound gun. And they're nowhere near as smooth as this thing ends up being. And I know a lot of people like to complain about this gun and say, well, of course it recoils light. It's a 9.5-pound gun. True, but it recoils disproportionately light because the system in it does work. And again, we'll get more into that later, but I did want to address, right, that's sort of what Browning's gimmick here with this shotgun was the recoil is actually quite light. Now, as I mentioned, ultimately this gun would end up being a sales failure, and probably the clearest reason for that is Browning didn't do a very good job of advertising it. It would show up in some Browning brochures, but they didn't send many out to gun stores, right, and this being sort of there in the early mid-90s. Not a lot of people found out about guns through the internet at this point, so it was sort of that old school, you'd have to see it in a store to really know it exists, or have it flood gun magazines in order to advertise it. I found 2 gun magazines that ever really talked about this. In addition to Gun Digest had a very short article, a very terse article about it, where it's like, this is a thing that exists. But normally Gun Digest gives glowing reviews of things, and so I'm not sure if they maybe didn't get to shoot one or what, but Gun Digest didn't have many words to say about this and just listed the fact that it was for sale. So ordering one of these things sort of involved knowing a guy who was a Browning dealer, who then knew who to call at Browning in order to get one ordered. And so obtaining them was a little bit of a difficulty. Additionally, sort of compounding that issue is, while you'd think buying a custom gun from a well-known brand that's got a warranty would mean that you've got a gun that would be covered under warranty, these guns did have problems where they've got a couple of vulnerabilities in them that people did break early on as they were figuring out how the guns worked. You'd send it in for warranty work and you wouldn't see it again for another 2 years because Browning didn't have the parts, or Browning didn't have the people that knew how the guns worked to be able to fix them quickly enough to get them back out to you. So ultimately the gun flopped for a mixture of, not necessarily the gun being fragile, I don't want that to be the takeaway there, but the gun being different enough that people ended up breaking it because they didn't read the manual and weren't exactly familiar with what they were doing. And then Browning being unable to keep up with the guns that were broken, and probably Browning assuming, the way this gun is, how is anybody going to break it? And probably they figured they didn't have to do much warranty work and ended up being wrong to some extent. As we take the gun apart, we'll sort of touch on some of those mechanical weaknesses in the system, because if you end up owning one, or you do currently own one, there's a couple of things that you should check out on these before you get to shooting them a bunch, because it is possible to damage these guns if they aren't properly maintained, which is sort of the impetus for me doing the disassembly video. I'll show you those things, and while I won't do a full detail strip in this video because that's kind of a long process when it comes to the trigger mechanism, I will at least take the gun apart enough to show you guys on the inside how it works. Because while it's very impressive to see it work in slow motion, ultimately this is a very, very simple gun, right? It's a single shot bolt action with a spring that moves the inner receiver inside of the outer receiver at the end of the day. Pretty simple system. And frankly, I think it's a very remarkable system because the recoilless system does actually work pretty well. And again, we'll get to that more in the shooting segment. Looking over this gun and the sort of features it provides, of course, out at the end of the barrel, we are threaded for invector choke. That was a thing that Browning was offering on most of their shotguns around this time. Additionally, right, I want to address the fact that this gun is like comically long. Most of that's because you have a receiver that's like a foot long, right? It's longer than an Auto 5 receiver. It's longer than most automatic shotgun receivers. It's huge, and in addition to a 32-inch barrel, makes this thing a monster. Like I'd mentioned, it weighs just under 9.5 pounds, like 9 pounds 3 ounces, something like that. So it is fairly heavy and fairly long and cumbersome, and we'll talk more sort of in the conclusion about why the ultimate combination of factors here I don't think actually makes a very nice trap gun. But for now, we'll just leave you with, there's quirks about this gun that ultimately make it so it's not, don't think about this as the ultimate trap gun, right? That's what Browning was trying to do, and I think they missed that mark, and that's probably why they didn't advertise it or push it as hard as they could have, because had this gun sold better, I think that its reputation would be worse than it is today, because more people would have seen it for what it really is. But we've got those interchangeable chokes. We have a high rib. The rib is adjustable for point of impact. So the rib can go to one of 3 positions to sort of, and again in shotgun terms if you're not familiar, to adjust the height of your pattern. So typically, especially with trap shooting shotguns, you want the sort of center of your shot pattern to be higher than your point of aim. So if your point of aim, right, your axis of your rib is down here, you'll generally want your shot pattern to be above it. And sometimes you want like 90% of the circle above it and 10% below. Some people want a full 100% above, and then you start talking in terms of how much gap, how much daylight is above the rib. But this gun is adjustable through 3 phases. That's a really nice system, and having an adjustable rib is a really cool thing. However, the way the adjustable rib works is because, as we'll see when we take it apart, this front section of the rib is sort of the part that gets adjusted up, down. The whole front rib gets adjusted for height, which means that this rib back here is only actually parallel to the front rib in one of the front adjustment positions. And so as you adjust it to the different positions, you either see almost no rib at all, or an excess amount of rib because your rib is no longer a completely straight siding plane. That's not a big deal because your mid bead and your front bead are both on that front rib. You just have to learn to ignore the rear part of the rib. It's a little bit of a funky system that certainly could have been designed quite a bit better. But once we get back to the receiver area, right, again, we have that rear section of the rib, we have our bolt handle. Currently the system is decocked, right, so the tension in that inner receiver drive spring is currently let off. Right before we take the gun apart, we'll go over how exactly that system works. But moving back further on the gun, there is adjustability built into this stock as far as the height and angle of the comb. There's a cinch bolt that runs up through the stock, and once loosened, you can set the stock through a series of angles. So more or less, if you can imagine the stock adjusting like this. The advantage there is you do get an adjustable comb. The problem is the comb doesn't adjust for height independent of pitch. So your comb drops as you get your comb lower, and your comb raises as you get your comb higher. For me, the gun does end up fitting me quite well with the way I've got it adjusted now, but certainly this is not exactly a one-size-fits-all system in the way that I'm sure you guys have seen, like the 4-way adjustable systems are, where you can adjust the stock for pitch up and down, but then you can also adjust the comb left, right, and up, down, and front, back. Right? Those sorts of systems have a lot more adjustability than this. Although I do understand what Browning was going for here, it would have been nice for them to have done, added that 2-pillar system. And in fact, I've seen people that like these shotguns that go ahead and have those 2-pillar systems installed in these stocks, because that would certainly give you a lot more adjustability. Finally, all the way out on the end, we do have adjustable length of pull through a series of spacers. The gun came with 4 spacers, 2 installed for me, ends up pretty much perfect for length of pull. Again, it is such a long gun that even me, as long-armed as I am, I can hardly ever find a gun that's quite long enough for me, in 2 spacers rather than all 4, and it's pretty big. Finally, we have our factory butt plate with its recoil pad, and that is adjustable up and down on the stock for height, sort of through a dovetail system. It's nice to have that adjustability because, at least for me, that is an important adjustment. I guess just sort of the overall amount of distance between my armpit and my cheek sort of necessitates that I want the toe of the stock to be lower and the comb to be higher for the gun to fit me perfectly. So you do have a semblance of adjustable comb height as an analog through the adjustable height of the butt pad. This is really getting into shotgun fit nerdery, but the thing that's really lacking from this stock is there is no adjustment overall for cast on or off, and there is no adjustment for toe angle on the butt pad. Fully adjustable shotguns will make it so the butt pad can adjust, I guess if I show it to you guys this way, it'll make the butt pad adjust this way, so you have the bottom of the butt pad face over here or over here, which can certainly make the gun much more comfortable. Additionally, with sort of custom fit stocks, you'll generally have some method for adjusting the cast on or off of the stock, which really refers to, the angle down the center line of the gun would be 0 cast, and this is spoken of from a right-hander's perspective, so being cast on would have the stock angled this way. Obviously not that drastically, it's usually between 1 and 3 degrees, but cast on would be that way. It's weird for a right-handed person to want cast on, but cast off would be the stock pointing off this direction. There is no adjustment, there is no provision for the way that system works, and in fact, because this stock has the adjustable pitch system it does, it would be pretty darn tricky to be able to get adjustable cast into this. So again, a little bit of a quirk, because cast is important, and cast is something that was adjustable on even consumer grade shotguns well before this thing, so it's a little funky to see it absent here from Browning's $5,000 adjustable shotgun, right? It's a little weird. I suppose final discussion on overall outside appearance, it does have a really, really wide trigger shoe. The thing's probably almost 1/2 inch. It's really wide, and it does make for this thing to have a very comfortable, maybe jerk-proof trigger. Of course, trigger jerking in shotguns isn't usually a big issue, but it can become a problem for people in trap shooting, especially as you get fatigued. That sort of tendency to flinch can end up causing trouble in trap in a way that it might not as so much in sporting clays or skeet, but a wide trigger shoe is certainly a nice feature to have on this gun, and it is entirely safetyless. There is no safety, no sort of toggle. It's sort of having that quasi-open bolt system with the reciprocating receiver inside of a receiver system would make a safety a little weird to implement. So it does lack that provision, and the manual goes to great lengths to explain that there isn't a safety. And of course, with regular trap shooting rules, right, you don't close your gun until it's your turn to shoot. And by the time that it's your turn to shoot and you've closed your gun, there's no need to have a safety on because you're about to fire it. So this isn't sort of like a hunting gun, right? A safety has some important purposes. You're maybe traversing rough terrain. It's a good idea to flick it on. This gun didn't envision hunting. And while I would like to eventually take it hunting, just because I think that would be interesting, I don't think that it's going to be particularly well suited to that. Our final point of discussion here, looking on the outside of the gun, will be to flip it upside down and press this latch here on the bottom of the handguard, which reveals a system that's used for cocking the barrel, the inner receiver assembly, back against the drive spring. Now, this forend is a really thin piece of wood with a very flimsy sheet metal reinforcement. This piece of wood was the most broken part, the most warranted part, as I understand it, on these guns. Because if you just sort of go crazy and go wrench on this piece of wood as hard as you can to try and cock the gun, in fact, this sticker even says, well, in fact, this sticker was added to explain, you only need to use this forend to push the action back until you hear it click. If you continue to push on it, right, and start bottoming out against the back of the receiver, this forend will crack without much force because it's just a thin, crummy piece of wood. But in general, the way that that system works is you would push back on the handguard until you hear that click, but you could keep pushing on this wood and break it. Obviously, we're not going to do that. But now that that process is done, we see our bolt handle has gone from the forward position to the back position. Now, lifting up on the bolt handle, we'll let the inner receiver come forward onto the sear, right there. Lift it up, pull it back. The inner receiver comes forward onto the sear. At this point, you could load the gun, close up the action, and now the gun would be ready to fire if we had a live round in there. And so the thing to observe is that the inner receiver will lurch forward when the trigger is pulled, and we'll look later and see slow-mo footage of the gun even firing to see that the striker mechanism grabs the striker and then drops the striker as the bolt is on its way forward. It's a very interesting system. But of course, the next thing to note is, see, our exposed metal is now back here behind the outer extension on the front rib, and the exposed metal we had at the front of the handguard is no longer there because that whole assembly, barrel and inner receiver, gets cocked backwards. Now, just to show you guys the lurch forward, I'll try and hold the gun steady here. The effect of the drive spring is pretty dramatic when the gun's not in your shoulder, right? It does an effective job of resisting 12-gauge recoil, and really that's because it lurches forward pretty hard. So we'll go ahead, hold on tight. The gun slugs forward pretty hard. And of course, if there was a live round in there, it would have fired and then recocked itself and allowed you to run the bolt again. When it comes to dry firing this, it's typically recommended that you avoid doing that. The gun does have this sort of steel spring here, and that steel spring is there to prevent the gun from battering itself whenever you dry fire it. But I have seen these springs crack from excessive dry firing on other people's guns, so it does seem to be a thing where dry firing should be avoided as much as possible. And to that extent, the thing that I would recommend if you have one of these guns is you can actually just cock it by grabbing on the barrel, sort of Winchester 1911 style, and maybe grabbing your other hand on the charging handle and just pull it back towards your lap. Makes it much easier to cock the gun, and then you don't have to worry about cracking the handguard. And additionally, whenever you then go to dry fire the gun, you can let the tension off of the drive spring by just pulling the trigger, one hand on the barrel, and easing it forward. Of course, you have to run the bolt first. With the bolt run, ease it forward. There we go. And that way you don't have to worry about breaking anything. Browning did recommend that whenever the gun isn't in use, you store it with the drive spring non-compressed. Probably, I don't know that that's because they're worried about springs buckling or anything. That may just be a pure safety thing, so that if the trigger gets bumped, the gun doesn't fall over, the gun doesn't have any sort of weird things happen. But you've got about 70 pounds of force, at the fully compressed stage, pushing that inner receiver forward. So if you can sort of imagine it in terms of like comparing to a Browning Auto 5 where you've got that friction system that's slowing things down, imagine you had a friction system that was slowing things down, but like in terms of a negative acceleration, right? It's slowing things down by moving it in the opposite direction, right? A negative vector first. And in that way, the gun is actually pretty darn effective at knocking down recoil. With that discussion aside, let's go ahead and see how to take the thing apart. Now, it's a little bit of an involved process, and probably something that contributed to the issues that the gun had is that if you just try and blunderbuss your way through taking the gun apart, you're very likely, I think, to run into issues, not only because the gun's fragile, but because it doesn't take apart like any gun that you're probably used to. Now, full disclosure, I've had this gun apart probably 10 different times. I've sort of got my own way of taking the gun apart because armorer's manuals for the gun, as far as I'm aware, don't exist. And you can find some instructions online on taking them apart, but some of the steps online are unclear or I think not helpful, sort of like out of order maybe. So I will run you guys through my way of taking the gun apart. And of course we will not do a full detail strip at this point because some of the parts of the trigger mechanism are just a real pain to take apart and then also to show to a camera. And frankly, it usually doesn't need work. I needed to take my trigger mechanism apart because, as we'll talk about whenever we get the gun apart, these guns do have a recoil buffer, and that recoil buffer is a very important part. I will show you how to diagnose it and find your recoil buffer and make sure yours is okay. But if these guns don't have that recoil buffer, they can damage themselves, or in my case, the recoil buffer dissolved and turned to like ground up eraser material, and it filled the whole trigger group, and it made the trigger group not work reliably. So certainly if you get in that situation, it's possible to take the trigger group apart, just like maybe get a flashlight and cover yourself with a towel and then take the trigger group apart so you don't lose any springs or anything. Don't ask how I know that. Anyway, to get this thing apart, right, our first step is going to be to take the front half of the rib off. This is done through this sex bolt. As far as tools that we'll be needing to take it apart, screwdriver with hollow ground tips. Do not try and use like taper tips on this gun. Just don't use taper tips on a gun in general. Only use taper tips on taper tip screws. It's very uncommon that guns have taper tip screws unless somebody's taken a hollow ground screw and destroyed it. A tap hammer is nice to have, a couple of regular punches. This screwdriver I only have. I'm going to demonstrate something for you guys once I've got the gun apart. I've got this screwdriver for that, but we also have a screwdriver bit that's the same size as this T-handle that came with the gun originally. A couple of the screws are Allen head and need that screwdriver to come out. Additionally, the gun came with, I guess for reference purposes, a little bit of extra hardware, because if you put the extra stock spacers, which I've got here, and if you put all 4 stock spacers in the gun, you end up needing longer screws to hold the butt pad assembly onto the stock. You've also got a little bit of extra hardware in here and an extra grub screw there for the front end, right, for the adjustment of the height of the rib. They gave you an extra of those as well. It came with an advertisement for Browning knives, very cool. It came with a choke set with an Invector choke wrench, right? Other Browning shotguns came with this. It's not that interesting. It came with a modified, improved, modified, and full choke standard because it's a trap shotgun. You don't need chokes besides that for trap unless you're doing something weird. Not that weird is bad, but Browning did not perhaps envision you doing very much weird stuff with this gun. Taking this screw out is pretty easy, right? This is a sex screw, a barrel binding bolt as they're known. It's a screw head on either side, and we will loosen it and show you, right? It's a screw that screws into a screw is the way these fasteners work. And you want to be careful, and you of course use the hollow ground tips, but on top of that, just be careful with all of the screws on this gun, because the screws are steel and they're into aluminum, right? So for reinstalling, we will want to make sure we don't over tighten. But also, if your gun hasn't been apart in a long time, steel and aluminum will try and stick to each other, not exactly through rust, but they'll sort of get gummed up. These screws for me were quite rusty when I took them apart, so I had to recondition them, and then I reinstalled them with Loctite. Because you've got steel screws that are bearing up on aluminum, if you tighten the screw up tight enough, you'll oftentimes deform the aluminum, and that's not fantastic. So at the very least, to avoid taking finish off of aluminum, if not deforming it, and that's how I do that. Out here on the front of the rib, right, this is just sort of a pilot that sort of holds the rib centered on the barrel. On my particular gun, the rib fit to this pilot was really loose, and at first I thought I'd need to print a new pilot, which would work, right? The pilot really doesn't do anything but ride on the barrel, or really the barrel rides inside of it, but this is non-structural. The pilot is just there to hold your rib straight relative to the end of the barrel, because that's important for the gun shooting in the right direction. But my fit between the rib and the pilot was so bad that I could push the rib to one side and it would click left, right, left, right, left, right, and it would stay in that left or right position. And so whenever you're looking down the shotgun, right, the rear rib would be straight, and then this rib would be like, depending on which way you pushed it. And there's no way that would be conducive to the gun shooting where you wanted it. So I installed a couple of shims in here and then reinstalled the grub screw, and since then it's only it's like a barely perceptible amount of play, and that the ability to sort of drift the front end of the rib by pushing on it is gone now, so that's good. With that removed, our next step, and I guess I should have prefaced, my preference for starting with the disassembly is with the bolt forward. Basically, I'm not sure that I'll narrate all the steps because I've done it. I've done it so many times now that there's parts of it that are just internal to me, which is frustrating because I'd like to give you guys as best video as possible. So I'll try and narrate every step, but more or less follow along what I'm doing, and everything I do should probably be done, and then the things I'm saying should maybe necessarily be taken with a grain of salt because I might not be saying every step. But our next step here with the recoiling assembly forward is going to be to remove this screw here. You can do that with this T-handle. If not, it's an imperial size. Don't use no metric, not on this gun. It's an imperial size. Stick that in there. And of course, you'll again avoid stripping out this screw, so make sure you use the right size hardware. If your gun hasn't been apart in a long time, the screw can be stiff. And then go ahead and do her up like that, loosen it up. Of course, I have a little bit of a Loctite residual on this bolt still, because again, right, I use Loctite on these screws because it's steel into aluminum. Because of that, you can't get the bolt perhaps as tight as you'd want to, and because you can't get the bolt as tight as you want to, using Loctite is how you ensure it doesn't rattle its way loose. Now, once we've got that screw out, we can take this lock out of the other side of the gun. That lock is what holds the upper, this rib assembly and handguard assembly onto the receiver. Once you have that screw out, the lock will be ready to come out, but it does fit awfully darn tight into that hole. So a punch that fits inside of the threads on this lock, and some light tapping should get it out. And at this point, there we have the lock. And just to show you guys, right, what I was doing with that punch was down in this hole. Stick the punch down in there and then tap, 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 tap this guy out. I'm gonna put these two together so we don't lose them. Set that over there. And once this step is done, the whole rib and handguard assembly will slide off the front of the barrel. Now, as you do this, try and avoid scraping the rib and handguard assembly against the barrel, because the rib and handguard assembly is aluminum and it will sort of mark the steel barrel. That said, to some extent, it's difficult to avoid doing it some. That gets that assembly off the gun. I can set the rest of the gun down here. When it comes time to reassemble, these little steel feet that are on here fit inside of a dovetail. That's how this rib assembly is held to the gun, with these dovetailed feet. However, these dovetailed feet can be tricky to get back in the gun. We'll talk about the correct method to get this on without too much trouble later during the reassembly portion. Doing things in the wrong order can make reinstalling this part a nightmare. And of course, the handguard is just going to flop because the part it actually latches against is the front of the receiver. Avoid letting this flop in a manner that can damage the wood because, as we mentioned, the wood is very fragile. But there's that assembly, and if you ever needed to replace any of these parts, they do come apart with roll pins and screws. And here is your, again, that brake, that cushioning spring for the barrel on the forward stroke. That's there if yours, for example, cracks, because I've seen one crack before. You can service them. I don't know if you can get extra ones, but maybe you could have somebody manufacture you one. But there's that assembly. Close it up and put it to the side. We are now down to our sort of receiver group, two receivers, our inner and outer receiver. The thing we'll need to pay attention to is keeping the gun upright at this point. There's a block here inside of an ovular hole. I'm going to call that the striker catch. I sometimes call it the sear catch, I'm not sure why, but the striker catch is probably the most proper name for it. It's a guy there on the top of the receiver that's responsible for catching the striker on the bolt as the bolt and barrel assembly comes forward. It catches the striker, cocks it, and then releases it as things move forward past it. And it is sort of the thing that's responsible for alignment, right? So this receiver, inner receiver, is round and it can rotate in the receiver. So this striker catch is responsible for the alignment of the receivers, as well as cocking that striker, as well as sort of providing a forward stop for things now that everything is back. Now that this part of the gun is off, right, that forward stop is now lost, that index point is gone. So this is sort of the thing holding everything into the gun. Sometimes the striker latch will just come out on its own or just with a little bit of wiggling, but on guns that haven't been taken apart in a long time, what you'll need to do is take the charging handle out and then screw the charging handle into the striker catch, and then you can use the charging handle actually to take it out, sort of like an intended hack or whatever, right? An intended reuse of the charging handle as a separate tool. Now, because I've had my gun apart recently, I bet the striker catch just comes out once we do this next part, but what we'll need to do is, with the buttstock in our lap, we'll pull the barrel back against the action spring, then use our T-handle and loosen the bolt handle here. So sort of like this, with the gun in our lap. Hopefully you guys have a pretty good view. Pull that back. Yep, as expected, right? My striker block will pop right out. If you guys' guns haven't been apart a lot, you'll wish that yours comes out that easy, because sometimes they can really fight you. But we will pull the barrel back, and we're not trying to pull it back far enough to cock it, just trying to pull it back far enough that our charging handle sort of clears this shelf here on the receiver. So you can see that shelf. The charging handle has a flange on it, so it has to be back in this area before it can come off. So we'll pull it back, get the Allen wrench there on it, and then loosen it. There we go. Apologize that that was slightly off camera, but that is sort of the trick of this gun, is it's really big and it's hard to show off to a camera. Now, if your striker block didn't come out on its own, right, if your striker block was still in the top of the gun, I want to rig it up for what it would be like for you guys real quick. So I will pull the receiver back, try to replace the striker latch. All right. So say you guys' gun is like this and the striker latch is, it's really tight in there and it doesn't just fall out on its own. What you can do is take the charging handle, thread the charging handle into the striker latch. Then what you'll do is, again, pull the barrel back towards you just slightly. Really only needs to be that far, and it should wiggle out. Once it's out, the barrel assembly is able to come out of the front of the gun. So we'll go ahead and pull it out. Sometimes you need to give it just like a little twist or a little wiggle, but it will pop out at that point. If during the course of getting the charging handle out of the gun, you cocked it, right? So you pull it back, you pulled the barrel back too far, and you hear that click sound that it's cocked. What you'll have to do is run the bolt handle so that the parts are now on the trigger. So the reciprocating parts, right? The inner receiver is now resting on the trigger sear. And once you get it that far, you can then take your charging handle out. You can take your striker latch out, but you'll have to sort of do the delicate thing of, once those parts are out, your barrel will be cocked back and just one hand holding it, one hand pull the trigger, and then just ease it out the front of the gun. So all that to say, try and avoid cocking the gun after you've got this part off. There's really no need for you to fully cock the gun until reassembly, after you've got this part off anyway. So with that said, we're now down to our receivers, right? Our inner receiver and our outer receiver. There's not a lot to see on the outer receiver. We'll talk about it more in a moment. The inner receiver is much more interesting, right? Because it's where our bolt group is. It's where our rat tail is here, and this is where our buffer is, right here at the back of the receiver. If you get your gun apart and there isn't a buffer, and of course your buffer probably won't be black, it'll be yellow or brown, right? It's nylon normally. I've made mine out of rubber here, and I'll explain why in a moment. But if you don't have anything back here, it's just metal, do not shoot your gun until you've replaced this buffer. Failing to replace this buffer can result in metal on metal contact. That metal on metal contact can end up causing peening that prevents this pigtail assembly from being able to wiggle freely. And in fact, if your pigtail assembly isn't able to weeble wobble all around, you may already have some of that damage going on. What can happen if there's enough metal on metal contact over time is you'll shoot the gun and it'll come all the way to the backwards position and just lock up and stay locked up in the back. And then you either have to disassemble your gun with it stuck in the back position, or sort of go through the delicate process of beating the gun with a hammer until things loosen up and then these parts go forward. It's just not a good time. So to avoid the hassle, if you have one of these guns, inspect the condition of your buffer. I think Midwest Gunworks has OEM buffers. I didn't want to get an OEM buffer because my buffer in this gun had disintegrated completely. The OEM buffers were also made in the 90s, and I can't imagine that they're going to last 30 years that the originals did. I imagine the 90s OEM ones aren't going to last much longer than 10 years of actual use, right? Because they've already degraded for 30 years in a bag. So I decided what I'd do is I got some high durometer rubber off of McMaster, and I just cut and ground it until it fit sort of like the original buffer did. But as a rule of thumb, right, if you've got your gun and you have a buffer that's at least there, take a screwdriver and poke it with the screwdriver. Just like poke, 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 poke with a screwdriver. If the screwdriver is able to cut it or gouge it or crack it, you need to replace your buffer, right? It's not doing anything at that point. So one way or another, right, you can do it out of rubber, use your original buffer as a template if you still have an original buffer. Like I'd mentioned, mine had turned to like little crumbs. And so I just sort of eyeballed the, the sort of shape, the discoloration, right, I guess you should say, where the buffer used to be. I use that as a template to just sort of cut and grind one out of rubber, and it's worked fantastic ever since. You don't really have to overthink it. You just have to have something of this approximate thickness to sort of keep metal on metal contact from happening is the gist of that story. The buffer's construction, in fact, you could probably even 3D print one out of TPU. I wasn't set up to print TPU at the time that I was doing this, or else, frankly, I would have done it because I think the TPU printing of buffers is really cool. But I just cut and ground one out of some hydrometer buffer stock. Many different ways you can do it. Important lesson being, don't shoot these guns without a buffer, and don't shoot these guns without knowing the condition of your buffer, because if you don't know, it might be like mine, where it's just like eraser crumbs in the back of the receiver, causing further trouble for the thing. But with that said, we can sort of see, right, we've got our bearing surfaces where on the front end of the gun the receiver rides, our bearing surfaces where on the inside of the receiver the inner receiver rides, and you can see it's sort of got, not sand cutter features, but it's got flats where it doesn't touch and then rounded areas where it does touch. That's sort of to keep debris out of the gun and to extend the amount of time you can go between cleaning it, because of course taking this gun apart to clean sucks. It's really not fun, and in the manual they said don't do it, and if you need it done, take it to somebody who knows what they're doing. And then the funny thing is I don't think anybody that's ever worked on these guns knows what they're doing, because they're not very intuitive. It's a difficult gun to learn to work with. But if you needed to get the bolt group out for any reason, I know these guns can sometimes break strikers. The way to do that is you take your buffer off, you then have wrench flats here on this nut that's on the back of the receiver. That comes off, your little pigtail comes off, and you can take your bolt off the back of the gun. Just to sort of show you guys a little quick detail on the bolt. Put our charging handle back on it. Makes it a little bit easier to manipulate. Getting a charging handle started is always a little tricky. I don't know if mine's just got a boogered up thread or what, but we'll note the bolt assembly on the parts diagram looks really complicated. I just want to tell you guys that it's not. The bolt head is a little 5-star dealie out here in the front. The bolt head sticks through the carrier for the bolt handle to be able to rotate it. And that's that rotation that goes on there. This is actually threaded into the bolt head and not the bolt carrier, which I guess you'd expect, right? That's normal for a bolt action, right? Is that the part that rotates is what's connected to the handle so you can rotate it. But then you have your bolt carrier body. Your bolt carrier body is a very complicated part mechanically, right? It's a lot of machining that goes on inside of it, but really all that it's doing is holding the bolt head and it's holding the striker. The striker there in the top of the gun works in a pretty darn simple way. Of course, we have our striker catch. Whenever this gun is ready to fire, right, like on the bottom of this group here, it's against the sear in the receiver, and that's sort of where your sear is held whenever the gun's waiting to fire. So whenever the gun's up against there, the striker latch here will be up against the striker. Holding the trigger will of course send the inner receiver forwards while the striker latch stays where it is, and that cocks the striker. Maybe you guys can see, you'll certainly see in the slow-mo footage of it shooting, as this unit moves forward it cocks that striker, and then once it comes to full cock, the striker assembly is able to pop down off of the striker latch, and then that fires the gun and then reverses it. Right? That's the gist of how this system operates. So the bolt grip is actually really, really simple. It's just probably more, it's complicated looking. I don't want to say more pieces than it needs to be. It's just complicated looking on the parts diagram. Because it's got to sort of be an open bolt gun and a striker fire gun and a bolt action shotgun all in the same group. But we can pop our charging handle back out here. It doesn't need to be there anymore. So there's that, and again I mentioned that sear surface there is probably the last thing we have to talk about while the gun's disassembled. We can take a look at the trigger group. Again, I'm not going to take the trigger group apart because it's a mess. It's one of Browning's finest moments, let's say. But these two screws can get you the bottom of the trigger group off, and I will just take it apart that far to show you guys. Unless you guys have a reason to go taking this bottom half of the gun apart, I'm going to sound like Browning's manual. There's no good reason to take it apart. There's nothing you need to lubricate down here. There's nothing you need to pay attention to down here. Unless your gun's got like a 20-pound trigger pull like mine would intermittently have because of all the eraser gunk that was built up in the gun, there ain't no good reason to go digging around inside of here. But if we pop this second screw out, we can take the trigger group off. What I recommend you do is you hold the trigger group on, rotate the gun upside down, right side up rather, right? Have the gun up, right side up, and then pull the trigger grip down off the bottom of the gun. The reason I recommend this is because there is a spring. The spring, I've got the spring coated in grease so it won't go flying. If your gun doesn't have the spring coated in grease, and you take the thing apart like this, that spring can go boink, and you'll have a hard time finding it again. But this bottom part of the trigger plate is really simple. You've got a trigger, and that trigger pulls this bar backwards. Pulling that bar backwards moves this little sheet metal guy backwards as well. Very, very simple thing going on there. And then you look at here and you go, oh my God, dear sweet God, what is that? What is that thing? It's your multi-pivoting striker sear mechanism thing. And I've seen a lot of people wonder, well, why is it this complicated? Well, the reason it's so complicated is, as we discussed earlier, you've got 70 pounds of push going on your inner receiver. And the thing stopping it from moving forward is the sear that's on the inside of the receiver, right? And it's just like a little dropping guy, because it has to be, right? It can't be more complicated than that, really. You just have this little guy that drops downwards. Now, that guy that drops downwards, if your trigger was just directly connected to it, you'd feel all 70 pounds of that's going on. It'd be a really crappy trigger pull experience. So it's got a multi-articulated system, and I guess just to give you guys a basic idea of how that works, your trigger interacts with this peg, right? Your trigger pulls this peg backwards, just like that. And that's all the movement it has. It just does that. Once that's back, this paddle here, I guess we can call it a paddle, can move up. Difficult to show you guys that, but this paddle moving up at this joint moves this piece like this. So this paddle and this piece visible here are jointed like this. So whenever the bar is pulled, right, these pieces do this. Whenever they do that, it allows, it sort of forces, right, because you've got mechanical advantage effectively, right, working against that spring force, moving this paddle down, moving this paddle up, as it were, allows the paddle on the inside of the receiver, which is tricky to see, but it's just a sear, right? It's just a typical dropping sear. And that typical dropping sear is sort of riding on this member. So if you can imagine, this guy does this guy does this, which allows this guy on the inside of the receiver to do that. And it does so giving you, against a 70-pound driving weight, a 8-pound, less than 8 pound, like a 6-pound trigger pull, a really not bad trigger pull at all. And the trigger pull isn't even extremely long, right? It's not like it's a double action trigger where you're going, Arr! A really crisp trigger pull for what this gun is, for what's going on in the trigger mechanism. So that is all very, very cool. Basically, that's all that's going on in the trigger group there. I guess there's this slight added quirk of complexity in that after the gun fires, of course, you have to rack the bolt for the trigger to be active again. That's really just this finger going on back there, and of course you lift the bolt up and then pull it back, and then you hear that click sound as this assembly moves forward, and then the sear surface comes to bear on the sear and there on the receiver. So you have that little bit of added complexity there as far as the trigger reset system. And as far as I could guess, the reason it has that trigger reset system is otherwise it'd be capable of doubling with the gun. Or, right, if you were shooting trap and you forgot to reload your gun, if you went to pull the trigger, you wouldn't have like your gun go slump forward and then have to manually cock it back and then reload it. It prevents you from getting the gun to go forward until you've run the bolt, ejected the previous round, and presumably reloaded it at that point. So it's a little bit of a convenience thing, right? Maybe the one convenient thing that was put in this gun is that the one creature comfort, the one idiot proofing thing that went on here. Otherwise, this gun is like an idiot trap, because nothing here is very intuitive, and there's a lot of pieces in this gun or things in this gun that you can break or lose just by being curious and trying to take it apart. So to get the trigger group back on, I recommend you guys grease the spring up, by the way. Right? Just stick it in a tub of grease and then stick it where it goes and close that lid up. It's not going to hurt the function if it's covered in grease. But this little hole there on this stamped metal arm has to line up with that peg there. I usually do it with the gun on the side or just the gun inverted to make this a little easier, but with that assembly on like that, you'll sort of close that down, get our two screws. These screws are the same length for the trigger plate. And we will reinstall the screws. Not a bad idea to install these screws with Loctite. Pretty much all the Loctite that I've put on them has wore off at this point. Again, it's a steel screw into aluminum A, but then B, the trigger group screws, for whatever reason, I've noticed have a tendency to come loose just through vibration of shooting. And that's probably just because of their physical location on the gun. ahead and snug this one up with the T-handle there. There we go. Got everything looking right there. At this point, we're ready for just reassembly in general. And normally in my videos, I fast forward the reassembly because it's the same thing as disassembly. It's not the case on this gun because nothing on this gun can be easy. Reassembly on this gun is one of the harder gun. I think maybe the Winchester Model 40 is a harder reassembly, but only by a little bit. This is a really, really hard gun to take apart. But we're going to soldier through it together. I will give you my method for doing this. I'm not saying it's the only method, but it's the method that I found works best. And in order to do this, I will first stand up here to show you guys just a quick look at the inside of the receiver. And I recommend, right, if you've got one of these guns in front of you and you're going to reassemble it, I recommend you look at the down inside of the receiver too and see if you can spotlight. Yeah, it's going to be really hard to do here on the camera. But there in the back of the receiver, you can sort of see it there, is an action spring plug, right? Like you're used to on other shotguns, right? Because underneath the stock, since we're not going to take it off, you just got a tube with a spring in it and then an action plug there on the front. We have to make the end of this rat tail find that plug just by dropping this down through the receiver. It can be tricky to do. Additionally, right, keep in mind where the striker position is. We want the striker position to be the dorsal upright position. So sort of, I guess to word that better, this is the upright position of the inner receiver. This is the upright position of the outer receiver. Keep them in the same relative position. So with everything upright, you will take your receiver, guide your pigtail down into the receiver, and again, keeping everything, right, keeping that vertical position on the barrel, vertical relative to the rest of the receiver, guide everything down. Try and keep everything as upright as you can. The pigtail usually does a good job of finding everything. About the time you get to this point, what you'll need to do is pull and hold the trigger back, because we need to get the sear out of the way of the receiver, right? The sear needs to drop so the receiver can come past it. And once you do that, if you've got springiness at this point, you know that you've done it correctly, right? The pigtail has found the action spring. However, at this point, what we want to do is cock the barrel back. So we will push the barrel down and cock it like so. At this point, avoid pulling the trigger. Even though you're supposed to have to run the bolt in order for the barrel to be on the trigger sear, sometimes this gun, before it has the top receiver rib put on, it doesn't have that correct function of the bolt handle having to be open in order for the trigger to be re-engaged. So just avoid pulling the trigger. This is the one time it would be nice to have a safety on this gun, but we don't have that. So what we're going to do is take our bolt handle, put it back into the bolt. And again, on mine, that's a little bit of a tricky proposition. There it goes. And we can go ahead and put this in there and snug it back up proper, like, right? Get it nice and tight. So what we want to do is open the bolt just slightly, and the reason we need to do that is because in order to install the striker catch, the striker needs to not be in its prime position, because otherwise there's going to be tension on the striker, and we don't want that because it makes it hard to install the striker catch. So what we're going to do is lift the bolt up and only take it back part way, maybe about that far. If you take it back further, right, you risk having the receiver come forward and then the trigger being re-engaged. And we don't really want to have to risk that, because in this current configuration, if you did pull the trigger, the barrel assembly is getting launched out of the front of the gun. I know a guy who has one of these that did this while trying to take it apart, and he damaged his barrel. You don't want to know what new barrels and or inner receivers and or anything on these guns cost, because it's too much money. So go ahead and learn from their mistake. And so what we need to do now is reinstall the striker catch. With the bolt pulled part way back, we're able to get the striker catch around the striker. However, the striker catch, as I mentioned, has that dual role of making sure that the inner receiver and outer receiver are aligned together. That's why I harped the importance of getting things aligned earlier. You should be able to see the track on the inside inner receiver and get that to line up with the window here on the outer receiver. If those aren't lined up, the striker catch will not install down into its pocket correctly. Use a punch here to get that lined up. If they are aligned correctly and you have the bolt pulled back part way, the striker catch will just sit flat in there. With the striker catch sitting flat in there, it's very easy now to get this rib on. If the striker catch isn't sitting flat and it's got a little bit of spring tension on it, you're going to have a bear of a time getting this on. It's possible, and I've seen some people say that's the right way to do it, but man, oh man, I sure don't think so. So while keeping the gun more or less vertical, right, because we don't want that striker catch to pop out of there, what we're going to do is take our front end assembly, and the first thing that we have to guide onto the barrel is that sort of a spring there that's sort of as a cushion. So we'll guide that onto the barrel very awkwardly, because at the end of the day this is just an awkward gun. And then what we're going to do is guide this part of the sort of rear end of the rib. We're going to guide into this slot on the top of the receiver. And remember, you have these two steel feet there and there that are going to sit inside of the T-slot on top of the receiver. And if you followed all of the instructions up to this point, this should just slide on without much of a fight. And again, as you're sliding this on, have the handguard be flopped down, because otherwise the handguard can beat up against the front of the receiver. Once you've got it this far though, you can latch the handguard back up, because everything is in its correct place. Again, it is important to follow these steps in that order. If your rear handguard, your rear rib assembly has trouble going on the gun, you probably messed up one of these steps, be it cocking or aligning or getting the bolt partway back. And if you've got one of those steps messed up, don't try and force things, because forcing things is how this gun, or these guns in general, end up broken. And you don't want to end up with one of these guns that's broken, because ain't nobody knows how to fix it. But we take our peg at this point, our block, push it back in. Again, if your gun is new, you might have to give it a little tippy tap with a hammer. New, or, you know, none of these are new, but haven't been taken apart in a while is the version of new I'm referring to here. Go ahead and spin that screw in, and again, this is a steel screw that's bearing up an aluminum shoulder, so you don't want to go nuts with it, and Loctite is a good idea. Probably next time I'll have this gun apart will be the time I reapply Loctite to the screws, because I usually only do a little dab, but most of that has worn off because I've had this gun apart so many times, both helping people fix theirs as well as, you know, becoming more familiar with it myself. Also, I've shot it enough, I did get it dirty enough, I felt like I needed to clean it just because I could feel grit in the gun as I was cycling it. But I will close the bolt just so it's not rattling around on us for our final step, which is going to be reinstalling our front rib. And this is the easiest part of the whole thing. Pilot goes on in the front. There's just a little slot that you line up in the back. We will then take our barrel binding bolt, line it up there, roll this sucker over, stick the other end of the screw through there, one-handed switch out our screwdriver bits, and then get this sucker buttoned back up. Alright, and with everything retightened there, we're ready for a little function check. So remember, we have not taken the bolt all the way to the back on this one, so it should click whenever we do it. Yep, there's our click. So now the trigger should be re-engaged. I will ease the barrel forward just to avoid dry firing it, just to show you guys. Wow, that's really hard to sort of like, you know, push 70 pounds together like that, but you should at least be able to slow it down on its way forward. I was able to catch it, but should be able to at least slow it down so that it doesn't beat itself up too much. But you hear it click as it goes forwards. You want to hear that click. I'll show this all to you guys again, and just note the things that you need to pay attention to. But that click as it goes forward is the striker. If you don't hear that click as it goes forward, you may have forgotten to install or installed incorrectly the striker catch. Thing to pay attention to there. But once that's done, the last part of the function check is pulling everything all the way to the back, hearing that it clicks, and then running the bolt and hearing that at the very rear end the bolt goes click as the inner receiver comes back onto the trigger. And then that sound that you're listening for would be, see if I can show the camera up close here. As we push, let the barrel come forward, you'll see the tail end of the striker is sticking out there, and that click is the striker snapping forward. And that is the function check process on this silly thing. That's pretty much what there is to it. Much aside from that, I think we'll go and do the shooting segment now, right? Because that's the next most important thing to see. But hopefully seeing the inner workings and seeing the complexity that's going on inside of there helps makes more sense to the people whose question are, why did they stop making it? Recoilless sounds so cool. I don't know that you can, I mean, you could simplify this system. I've thought of ways it could be simplified at least a little. You can't simplify it a lot, though. It ends up being the complexity of 2 guns in one, right? It's got the same problem as the FG42, or other guns that had that closed bolt semi but open bolt full. You end up having the complexity of 2 guns put into one. It's a difficult thing to get around making it more simple or making it more robust, because necessarily there has to be a lot of trade-offs in putting 2 guns in one. You have a bolt-action shotgun in an open bolt system with a striker mechanism. It's a mess, right? There's a lot of stuff going on inside of this gun. And because of that, there's a price to be paid ultimately in it being hard to take apart, and it having a lot of fiddly pieces, and it being something fragile, and it being something that has little bits and bobs that can just get missed because you didn't know they were there, because you couldn't know that they were there, because there isn't information on taking these silly things apart, which is very frustrating. Hopefully, that sort of little quick disassembly process will help some people with figuring out how to maintenance theirs. And perhaps maybe I'll even just upload that disassembly section as a standalone video just to give people that point of reference for at least finding if your buffer is okay, right? That's sort of the one weak point, and then let people go from there. But besides that, that's our quick overview. I think it's mechanically, I don't want to say fascinating, it's very interesting. Not necessarily in only good ways. It's interesting in bad ways too, but that's the Browning Recoilless in a nutshell. We'll talk more about it in our conclusions, talk more about the weirdness of maybe shooting the thing and how that contributed to it being not terribly successful. But the thing I want to preface before we get to the shooting section is that this is an incredibly smooth shooting shotgun. And the shooting segment, I'm afraid, might not capture the actual smoothness of that, because whenever you actually watch the gun shoot on camera, it looks like it's still got a pretty decent amount of recoil. Like it maybe looks like it recoils as much as maybe a regular 9-pound shotgun would. And ultimately that's true, and I'll let you in on a little secret. Physics is a thing that exists, and there is no free lunch. There is no recoil deletion that can happen. In slow-mo footage, you'll see whenever you pull the trigger on this thing, the same spring that's pushing the inner receiver forward is pushing the rest of the gun backward, and it starts recoiling at that moment. What makes this gun's recoil system work, what makes it feel like you're shooting a 22 or a 410 in terms of impact, is because that assembly moving forward starts the recoil before the round's fired, right? You start moving gently with the gun before the round's fired. It then fires on its way forward and gently comes backwards against that very heavy spring. And if it bottoms out at the back of the receiver, it only barely bottoms out, probably equivalent to a 22 or a 410. So the overall amount of movement you'll have, in some ways, could even be greater than that you'd normally get from like a 9-pound shotgun. But the feeling of that recoil, the amount of time it's spread out over, is what makes this thing such an incredibly smooth shooter. Because if you were to graph the movement of the gun from the perspective of the shooter, right, so relative to the stock and the outer receiver, the movement of this gun is going to be like a very smooth, low curve, right? It's never moving very fast. Meanwhile, if you graphed like a long recoil gun that bottoms out really hard, or a gas-operated shotgun, right, you have that little bit of a peak of the initial spring, right, a little bit of ramp up from the spring getting compressed, and then something slams shut, and then it's very peaky, and that peak is what hurts in shotgun recoil. It's the uncomfortable part. It's the part that bruises you, right? It's the part that beats you up. This gun doesn't really do that at all. And it's not because it's deleting recoil. It's because it's got a very interesting mechanism of springs and time delay that changes up how that works entirely. It's a very, very neat system, and just keep that in mind as you go through the video. As I'm anticipating comments of people going, well, that doesn't look recoilless to me. And yeah, that's true. It's not literally recoilless. That wouldn't work. It's not a thing. You can't do that. But what it is really, really smooth to the point that you forget you're shooting a 12 gauge. And that's the magic here, right? That's the grand reveal, is that it does not feel like shooting a 12 gauge. And maybe we'll mix in, shooting off of my chin or off of my face or something, depending on how I'm feeling whenever I'm shooting the thing, how bold I'm feeling. But the thing is much, much smoother, much more comfortable in recoil than most other shotguns. Anyway, that's enough prattling. let's get to the part that you're all really here for, the shooting segment, and then come back for some closing thoughts. We are outside with our long shotgun. We've got the recoilless out here, ready to shoot a couple of targets with it. Now, a couple caveats to get out of the way. As I usually explain, we're shooting targets that are relatively close, so that you guys' viewing experience of the targets is prioritized over me having a more difficult target that's farther out there that you guys can't see as well. That also gives me the excuse of it's an easier target, so that we don't have to worry about missing as many. However, with this particular gun, of course, it was set up for trap. Browning Recoilless Trap was sort of the name of the thing. And this is much closer than a typical trap target would be. And I believe I have the improved modified choke in the gun, so we're certainly choked quite a bit tighter than we'd need to be. So bear with any misses that you see. This is, of course, not necessarily the kind of target this gun was meant to shoot at, but we will suffer along together. We'll start off here with some light loads. These are 1 ounce loads going like 1180 foot per second, so they are relatively gentle. But out of this thing, a relatively gentle 12 gauge load becomes like 22 or 410. It's like devoid of recoil, like it feels like it didn't go off or you had a squib. Levels of it's just like there's no recoil there. We'll have some more videos where we sort of look more specifically at how smooth that recoil gets. But before we do that, I'd like to go ahead and show it off, maybe shooting some targets. The one thing that you need to pay attention to when shooting this gun, and this is probably the most valid criticism of it, is after you pull the trigger, as we sort of showed with the internal mechanism of the gun, there's a little delay, right? The reciprocating assembly has to go forward quite a bit before it actually fires the round while it's still on its way forward. Because of this, after you pull the trigger, there's a barely perceptible, before the gun fires after you pull the trigger. It's probably comparable to like shooting something percussion cap maybe, or something that just, a gun that has a lot of lock time. And of course, lock time being the time between when you pull the trigger and the round is actually set off. So this thing has much longer lock time than you may be familiar with or used to. There's just that barely perceptible before the gun fires after you pull the trigger. Because of this, follow through on your swing becomes incredibly important. Some people can get away with having poor follow through, poor swing with their shotgun because they just sort of time where the bird is going to be, point the gun there, and then just fire it. And then the bird runs into their pattern. That's not really an option with this gun unless you're good at factoring in that little bit of delay, that little bit of time it takes for the gun to fire. Really, in order to shoot this gun well, you have to be really, really good at having a nice, smooth swing. And I'll be the first to say, that's not me. My swing will be juddery at times. I'll take multiple leads at something. I'm certainly prone to all of the errors that happen when it comes to shooting a shotgun in that regard. And this gun will lay bare all of those deficiencies. There will be lots of shots where you're like, I swear I was pointed straight at it. And with a regular shotgun, you would have hit it, but because this thing has just a little bit of delay, and because you stopped the gun right when you pulled the trigger, you shot behind it with this, because this thing has just a little delay before it actually fires. So shooting this thing well requires that you have nearly perfect fundamentals in comparison to any other shotgun. And because of that, this thing sort of has the opposite of a handicap built into it. It makes it harder to shoot this gun because it requires perfect fundamentals to shoot well. If you have those same perfect fundamentals and apply them to a different gun, you would be at an advantage, right? Because you'd be having your smooth follow through where you don't need it, as opposed to your smooth follow through where you miss unless you have it. So that is one thing to keep in mind. One legitimate criticism of this gun is people say the trigger is heavy. I've not experienced that on any examples. People say that the trigger is like really long or it's gritty. Haven't experienced that at all. The people who say that there is a perceptible delay after you pull the trigger and the gun fires, that's absolutely true. The gun does do it. And in the slow-mo footage, we'll even be able to show some of that. But that's more than enough yapping. Let's go ahead, put a couple of these light rounds to the gun, shooting at birds, see what we can hit, see what we miss, and then we'll talk and show a little bit more about how the gun actually works. That was not a very good shot I had at that. Another problem with this gun is that even with the rib adjusted so that the pattern shoots as low as possible, it shoots like a 90% above the rib, 10% below, so you have to hold quite a bit below anything you're shooting. And with targets this close, that just doesn't feel, at least for me, it does not feel natural at all. Me being an automatic shooter and not typically an over-under shooter, and this rib is certainly straight off of a trap gun. Couldn't tell you, I think I shot over that one. Go ahead and take another shot here. Couldn't tell you on that one. I think I might have been ahead of it. Slow down and think about this a little bit.
Couldn't tell you on that one either. Just having a great time showing off my lack of skill here. Man, I can't tell you. I think I might be shooting over all of these. I'll try one that I hold way low. Yeah, well, wouldn't you know it. I had like maybe 4 birds worth of daylight between the top of the rib and the bird. So yeah, this thing, it shoots high because it's meant to be shot at trap targets where you usually leave a little bit of a gap. But we'll go ahead, get some more ammo, try that again. All right, as a fun test here, we'll do one of these light rounds, and then we'll follow it up with one of the heavy rounds, maybe from the first person perspective to show you guys that even with heavies, this thing really doesn't move you much at all. Go ahead and see what we can hit here. I thought I had this thing figured out. We'll go ahead and try one more light load just for fun. There it is. Now we'll switch to a heavy load. It's an 1 1/8 ounce. I think 1,200 foot per second. It's a 3 dram load. So it should have more kick to it, but in this gun, more kick is not usually very perceptible. Yeah, like I said, I didn't feel myself move when I shot that. Try another round here. See if we can actually hit with it. Tell you what I did, I stopped the gun big time. Try another heavy here. There we go. I slowed the gun down, but that's what it was needed in that case. But there you have it. The thing is just so comfortable to shoot. And to show off how comfortable it is to shoot, I think what we need is a little bit of slow-mo, a slow-mo close-up on the action. I want to attempt a test that was used in the marketing of this gun where you place a fired shell on the rib and then shoot the gun, and the fired shell shouldn't fall off. Whereas with most other shotguns, at the very least, it's going to wobble, if not fall clean off. But we'll go ahead and attempt a couple of slow-mo shots here. All right, we'll try it with a light shell. Put one out on the bead. Go ahead and open it up just to be safe. Put one out on the front end. Close her up. Hold it as tight as I can. Yeah, so that's a bunch of marketing nonsense. It does not recoil very much at all, but it recoils enough that it's going to hop an empty shell off of the top of the rib. Just to test this theory one other way, we will try a heavy, but with our shell at the mid-rib position. It is a little windy today, but I can assure you the shell falling off is not because of the wind. Go ahead and hold it tight. Yeah, that's just, it's not staying on there. Just because I don't think that the softness, the smoothness of the recoil is coming across very well on camera, I do want to do a test that I don't advise you do at home, but Gonna take an extra light here. This is 1 ounce, 1180 foot per second. Winchester calls it extra light, but it's really just a typical light load. And I'm going to shoot the gun off of my chin here. Something sort of like this. Give it a 3, 2, 1. It did bite me, right? You do feel it in your neck, but doing that with an 870, I don't see how that wouldn't bruise you or give you actual neck problems. Meanwhile, with this, it's not comfortable. I wouldn't want to repeat it often, but it's in party trick tier category, right? Because doing that with a different shotgun would really, really suck. Doing that with this, I mean, I could do it again. In fact, I've got another round just to sort of show you guys, to prove the haters wrong. I'll do it off of the same place on my chin even. Get ready here. It's not comfortable, but it can be done. Meanwhile, with practically anything else, I can't even imagine, like a long recoil gun that bottoms out hard or a lightweight gas gun. Of course, this is no lightweight gun, and I guess we should again address that fact. This is a heavy gun, but even if you put enough weight on an 870 to get it to weigh, the 9-10 pounds this thing weighs, it's not gonna be a very comfortable experience. And I don't have like whiplash in my neck. I'm not bruising, right? I can touch my face. It's not sore. Again, it's not comfortable. It's like getting slapped, as opposed to anything else. It's gonna be like getting rocked in the jaw. You're gonna be bruised, your jaw will be sore, your neck's gonna hurt for a week, right? But with this, it's not that bad. As another experiment here, just to show you, again, using a AA heavy, I will fire the gun with it completely out of my shoulder. I'm not gonna wrap a hand there because the bolt does reciprocate, but maybe something like this. Hold the thing like it's a gigantic pistol. I'd like to see someone handle, I'd like to see how an 870, right? Somebody does that with an 870 or a pump gun or a double gun, because it's gonna move a lot more than just, It's certainly a pretty impressive thing. Do it again, another heavy here. I don't mind repeating this test. Go ahead and hold it thereabouts. And 1, 2, 3. It's really comfortable to hold on to that way. And I know right before somebody says it, that's a 9-pound 12 gauge. Of course it's gonna be possible to do that. Sure, that's true, but even if you did that with a gas op Beretta, right? That's they're at the 8.5, almost 9-pound range. By the time you're putting tubes and stuff on it, you can't get the gun to shoot quite that smooth. The spring system does work. It does soften out the recoil, but at the end of the day, you still have an equivalent amount of momentum is still going on, right? Even though you have that spring system that's sort of spreading it out by pushing it forward and then getting knocked backwards, you do still have, that spring only cancels out so much of the momentum of the fired shot, right? And even still, that spring stored energy is going in both directions, right? The spring pushing this forward pushes the rest of the gun backward into your shoulder. So there is no free lunch, there is no magic recoil reduction mechanism. There's just systems to spread out the recoil over more time. And when it comes to systems that do that, this one does it really, really well. It's just that on camera, the gun's going to still look like it recoils some, because you still have about the same amount of momentum, and it's going to move the gun about the same amount, right? Between here and here, the gun's gonna move about the same distance. But the sort of intuitive, right, the cool thing that's happening there is that that's happening over such a longer period of time that in your shoulder, it feels like a push, right? It feels like somebody just pushing you, as opposed to, with a pump gun or double gun, it's somebody going, right? Somebody's really kicking you hard every time you pull the trigger. Whereas with this, it's really, really smooth, like a gentle push. Well, that's pretty much it for what I had planned for shooting here with the Browning Recoilless. We'll go ahead and do just a couple more rounds of heavy shooting at clays, but the gist of this gun is that the recoil system does work, but I don't know that, especially if you said this gun still costs $4,500, would I say that the recoil system's worth that? No. Sometimes you can find these things for about $1,000, and is the recoil system worth that? I think it's unquestionably yes. It definitely does smooth out the shooting experience quite a bit. I've had days where I've done, the usual 150, 200 rounds through this gun, not sore at all the day after. I can't say the same thing about any but the smoothest of my long recoil guns. And even then, I'll sort of have that tenderness right on my cheek where my cheek rides the stock. Doesn't exist with this gun, because this thing is just really, really smooth. But with that yammering aside, we'll go ahead and shoot, I don't know, maybe got 4 or 5 more shells in my pocket. Let's go ahead and shoot those, and then we'll go back inside for some final thoughts on this thing. I really wish I could figure out where I'm missing with this thing, but I guess that's just the way it goes. It's probably just I'm so over-choked, my lead has to be perfect because my pattern's probably about the size of a bird. All right, so on that one, I didn't hold very far under it, And I didn't lead it by very much, so I'll try that same thing again. Yeah, it didn't work that time. Not entirely sure. I think this is my last shell here. Let's see if we can go out on a high note. The answer is no. I have to redeem myself. All right, going for redemption here. I remember what this gun's pattern looks like. I'm gonna try less lead and hold just a little bit lower than I have been and see what that gets me here. All right, that's promising. Quite a bit less lead than I have been giving them with this. Of course, the width of the rib might be what's throwing me off there, also the width of the front sight. I may be misinterpreting how much lead I actually have to give these because of that. All right, that was practically no lead at all. I think we figured out the secret to these targets. Yep. So I have been shooting ahead of several of these while trying to figure out how this gun works, but I think we got the hang of it now. All right, just that easy. Got the gun figured out now, which is a shame because we're gonna be done shooting it. Let's go ahead, roll any more slow-mo footage that I haven't cut in before now, and then we will send you guys back to the table inside for some closing thoughts on this really weird shotgun.
Alright, and we're back inside, and that's been the Browning Recoilless. There's not much else to say about the thing other than to reiterate, it has a lot of interesting concepts. The recoil mitigation system in it does work, and it works pretty darn well. And ultimately, right, if we're to sit here and discuss what-ifs or hypotheticals, you could make a version of this gun, and in fact, maybe one day I'll get one of these that's broken and in need of work and do this to it to sort of make my own custom, perfect Browning Recoilless, because the drive spring in this gun is certainly not optimized necessarily to any one size of load. As we saw, even with light loads, the gun does cycle, and it doesn't quite bottom out consistently with light loads, but with heavy loads, it does consistently kiss in the back of the receiver. There's certainly a way with some sort of like a compensator or a choke system, a choke compensator combo system out on the end of the gun. You could delay recoil or mitigate that recoil even further. Additionally, having a drive spring that's better attenuated to the specific loads that you're trying to use in the gun, so specifically a heavy trap load such that it wouldn't cycle with a light trap load, some sort of a mashing system going on there would get this thing to the point that it could be even smoother with those heavier loads, or even smoother with the light loads, and then the recommendation that you don't use heavy loads in it. So there's certainly more min-maxing that could have gone on with this gun, but as we sort of mentioned in the beginning, Browning never actually really put their full force, their full weight behind this concept, and as a result, especially compared with the fact that it cost as much as it did never really go anywhere. And that's unfortunate because there are interesting concepts here, but at the end of the day, the sort of delay that's built into the system, right, the extended lock time from pulling the trigger and then everything moves forward, makes the gun a little tricky to shoot. And I think the slow motion footage, you could see the fact that between the trigger pull and the gun firing, there is a noticeable delay in slow motion. And when you have the gun in your shoulder, you do notice that. It's not quite like shooting something black powder or flintlock. It's not quite that much delay. It's probably, really, it's more akin to like an open bolt firearm, where you just have the perception of movement before the gun fires, the shoot bang sort of thing is, I guess, the best way to describe it with words, is there's just like a hesitation and then the gun fires. And if your swing through isn't good and consistent, that can cause you to miss with this gun. And in fact, in the time that I've tried using it for trap shooting, I have missed targets that I would have hit, that I swear I would have hit with any other conventional shotgun. But because this thing has more delay, you can't really do that sort of snap shooting that maybe you become accustomed to for you're anticipating the bird's going to go right for whatever reason. Like say you're on station 1 in a game of trap, you're anticipating the bird's going to go right because sometimes your brain just convinces you it must be going that direction, and then just out of the corner of your vision you see it break hard left while you're on station 1. A lot of the times your only real good chance to hit that is just to try and catch up to it as fast as you can and shoot, sort of get up to it and then shoot where it's going, right? You try and snap shoot it. But with something like this, that's a lot more difficult to do. That sort of instinctive or that instinctual shooting that you can do with guns that have a very similar lock time doesn't work here. And that can become very, very frustrating. And I've seen some other people who bought these things back in the day that sold them because they couldn't hit anything with them. And dollars to donuts, I bet you that's because they had done that sort of instinctive shooting where they're not necessarily trying to have perfect form and perfect swing through. They just know how their gun shoots and they know how to hit targets with it. And using something like this is going to throw that off in a pretty dramatic way, because you've got like 5, 10, 20 times more lock time than you do in a gun that just has a hammer that goes tink and then the gun fires, whereas this has to go lurching forward and then fires, and then the action reciprocates backwards, of course. So that's the Browning Recoilless. Just sum it up one more time. Really interesting concept. It does reduce recoil in a pretty substantial way, but as a mixture of market factors plus mixed with the mechanical weirdness of this gun, it really wasn't quite perfect for trap shooting. It really wasn't quite perfect for, you can't do anything besides trap shooting with it being a single shot. I guess maybe eventually I'll try taking this thing hunting, just because that would be kind of funny to do. I imagine you could at least have some success with it. It's not necessarily slow or poor handling, but it doesn't really do anything very well, and especially if you imagine this costing $4,500, $5,000 in today's money back in the day. That's a lot of money to spend on a trap gun that's harder to shoot than pretty much any other trap gun that's on the market, and the only upside you get is, admittedly, a much lower recoil impulse than you can find elsewhere, but I don't know that the added difficulty justifies the reduction in recoil, unless you're somebody who's particularly recoil averse. However, in my experience, I find that people who are recoil averse, right, people who can't stand the recoil of maybe 25 rounds of heavy 12 gauge in a row, typically these people lack the upper body strength to be able to wield a 9.5, 10-pound shotgun, and as a result, this thing doesn't really help them, right? Because they can't hold the gun up steady without shaking and wobbling all over the place. So the fact that it doesn't kick them as much doesn't really matter, because they can't hardly hold it up in the first place. So maybe in a world where Browning came up with a version of this gun that's 7 pounds, maybe 7.5 pounds, something like that, it has an adjustable system so that you can tune the weight of the drive spring to the weight of the shells you're using, and perhaps maybe a little bit more thought put into how this rib system works. While I'm sure it doesn't actually end up being a difference in how it shoots, it's just disconcerting to know that the rib has a little bit of weeble wobble out there at the end, and that's probably just entirely internal to one's head. And while I could probably make a separate video on this entirely, people who don't shoot shotguns, especially don't shoot trap a lot, may wonder, like, well, what's the problem of a psychological issue? Trap is mostly psychological. It's a game of concentration at the end of the day, because by the time you've done maybe 10, 20 rounds of trap, you've seen every combination of targets that you could ever run up against. But it's hitting all of those targets consistently that becomes really, really hard. And that's just a game of concentration and beating your own mind's anticipation. And because of that, I don't think that this is really the perfect gun for that. It's got those built-in psychological weirdness factors. It's got that delay that is probably the ultimate psychological barrier to get past. Is like you have to have a more perfect swing than a perfect swing in order to hit something with this. And because of those factors, I don't think that this is ultimately a very good shotgun, and I believe that its lack of success was probably pretty justified. And I don't say that a lot about guns that were unsuccessful. Usually I think guns are do a better shot than they got. I think this gun got the shot that it was owed, and relegated to the dustbin of obscurity is probably about where it belongs, because at the end of the day, it doesn't even really do the one thing that it's meant to do very well. Unless you relegate what it's meant to do to be a light recoiling shotgun, in which case it is really, really good. Just like maybe don't try shooting trap with it with the expectation that it'll make you a better shooter, because the first time I shot around a trap with this, one of my worst rounds that I'd shot in a long time. Probably took me 10 rounds of practice with this to relearn how to shoot trap, because it just makes it that much more difficult. But I feel like I'm sort of repeating myself at this point. That's been the Browning Recoilless trap. I hope you guys have enjoyed the video. Maybe at some point in the future I'll do a detailed breakdown where I get the stock back off of the thing and get the whole trigger group taken apart, for maybe anybody who's got one that's broken, that's curious about how that process works, or sort of fixing it. But otherwise, that's the gun. I think it's cool. I think they're neat. If you can find one for about $1,000, I don't think they're a bad deal, just because of how neat that is. But don't go and buy one expecting that it'll make you a better shooter, and don't go and buy one thinking that it's actually a good, like, custom-made trap gun. I've shot a couple, sort of those custom trap guns. All of them inspired a lot more confidence than this thing does. And at the end of the day, right, if this was still $5,000 today, a lot of those custom trap guns you can get, like the Butlers, or gosh, there's several custom trap guns, right, that are out there, low rate production stuff that all inspire much more confidence than this, at about the same price point that this thing was made originally. So I'll leave you guys with that. I guess if you liked the video, if you like these sorts of videos or other sorts of videos, I don't really have a particular theme I stick to much anymore these days, but shotgun videos or some weird gun history deep dives and sometimes some printed stuff. you can go ahead and check out the Patreon. Of course, the Patreon support helps me make more of these sorts of videos. The more Patreons, the more videos, I suppose, is how that works at the end of the day. And of course, we do polls sometimes, right? This shotgun was picked as a result of a poll because I have weird shotguns sometimes that don't fit into the series of long recoil shotguns I'm doing. And so when I want to do a shotgun that's not a long recoil gun, you guys can sort of weigh in on those. So I appreciate you guys who are Patreons, I appreciate you guys who consider it, and I just appreciate you guys who watch the videos, because ultimately it brings me a lot of catharsis to know that I'm not the only one who thinks stuff like this is really cool. But I will leave you guys with that and tell you guys to have a good day, and you know, how about this? How about a personal message? If you are someone who thinks shotguns might be interesting, might be for you, I recommend you go to a pawn shop, buy a cheap 12 gauge or whatever. It can be even like just a cheap break action or whatever. And find a place that has sporting clays or trap or skeet local to you, and just go and try it. You'll have to put up with the old people, right? And the old people are generally not very welcoming. Sometimes, right? This isn't always the case, but sometimes the old people aren't welcoming of new people. But if you show up there and you ask questions and you make it clear to them that you're new and you want to learn, usually they might give you a little bit of shit, but usually they'll help you learn. And it's a really cool thing, and it's something we ought to reclaim from the FUDs, because I've said it before and I'll say it again and I'll continue saying it. I think shotguns are the most fun that you can have with a firearm. It beats out two-gun and pistol shooting and rifle shooting and all this stuff. Shotguns are just so much fun. So if you're curious about it, right, you don't have to start off with a great long recoil gun or a Browning Recoilless or anything like that. Just get the cheapest shotgun at your pawn shop, right? Even if it's a Turkish piece of shit, it's $200, right? $150 in some cases, or less in some cases. Buy it and just see how it goes for you, right? You might like it, you might hate it, but I think if you give it a shot, you're going to like it more likely than you're going to hate it. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time.